You didn't become this way overnight. There wasn't a single morning where you woke up and felt suddenly empty. It was quieter than that. At first, it just felt like you were tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that stays with you, even on good days. The kind that sits beside you while you're laughing, and no one else can see it. So you ignored it, because your life still worked. You still showed up. You still replied to people. You still did what was expected of you. From the outside, nothing was wrong. And that's where it became dangerous. Because when nothing looks broken, no one thinks to look closer. Not even you. You weren't falling apart. You were still functioning. But somewhere along the way, functioning quietly became your replacement for living. And no one noticed when it happened. Not when you started saying, "I'm fine," without thinking. Not when you stopped explaining yourself. Not when your reactions became smaller, safer, more acceptable. You adapted so smoothly. You became easy to keep, easy to predict, easy to overlook, including by yourself. And this is how it began. Not the loss of your life, but the loss of you inside it. Not all at once, but in fragments. In the moments you stayed silent. When something inside you wanted to speak. In the moments you agreed. When something inside you wanted to resist. In the moments you smiled, but felt nothing behind your eyes. Each time it felt small, temporary, necessary, but those moments were not harmless. They were training you, teaching your nervous system something you never consciously chose. That being fully present was not required. That being real was optional. That being acceptable was safer than being alive. And slowly, without realizing it, you stopped showing up inside your own life. You were still there, still visible, still moving, but something essential was no longer with you. And the most unsettling part is how normal it started to feel. If you're not depressed, then what is this? Because depression has a name. It has symptoms, it has explanations. But this feels harder to define. You still get out of bed, you still go to work, you still respond when people talk to you. You haven't disappeared from the world, but somehow you've disappeared from yourself. And that raises a question most people never stop to ask. What actually happened to you? Because people assume emotional numbness comes from trauma, from loss, from something dramatic, something obvious, something they can point to and say, "That's when everything changed." But what if that moment never existed? What if there was no collapse, no breakdown, no visible turning point? What if instead this happened while everything looked fine, while your life was moving forward, while you were being told you were doing well, while you were becoming the version of yourself everyone expected you to be? And that's what makes this so difficult to recognize, because nothing feels wrong enough to justify how empty you feel. So you blame yourself. You assume you're ungrateful. You assume something is wrong with your mindset. You assume you're the problem. But what if you're not? What if this feeling is not a sign that something inside you broke, but a sign that something inside you had to go quiet? And if that's true, then this didn't happen randomly. It didn't happen because you're weak. It didn't happen because you failed. It happened because something was slowly teaching you to stop being fully there. Most people believe emotional numbness means something is wrong with them, that it's a flaw, a malfunction, a sign they've somehow failed at being human. So they try to fix it. They try to think more positively. They try to be more grateful. They try to force themselves to feel something, anything. But the harder they try, the further away it seems. And eventually, they stop trying. Not because they don't care, but because nothing responds. And this is the moment where the most dangerous misunderstanding takes root. You start believing the numbness is you, that this is your personality now, that this is who you became. But numbness is not who you are. Numbness is something your nervous system learned to do. Because at some point, feeling everything became too expensive, not necessarily because of one catastrophic event, but because of repetition, small moments, repeated over and over again, moments where being fully honest created friction, moments where showing emotion created distance, moments where being yourself created subtle rejection. So your nervous system paid attention. It noticed what was safe and what wasn't. It noticed which version of you was accepted and which version was quietly pushed aside. And without asking for your permission, it began adjusting, not to destroy you, but to protect you. It started lowering the volume, reducing your reactions, filtering your impulses, until eventually, You stopped feeling things as intensely, not because you were broken, but because your system was trying to keep you functional. And functional people survive. Functional people keep their jobs at peace. Functional people maintain relationships. Functional people don't create problems. Functional people don't risk abandonment. So your nervous system chose functionality, even if it meant sacrificing aliveness. And at first, this worked. It made your life smoother, easier to manage. You experienced less conflict, less chaos, less unpredictability. But there was a cost, a quiet cost, one you didn't notice immediately because nothing dramatic happened. There was no moment where you suddenly felt yourself disappear. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a gradual shift, a slow movement away from your own inner signals. Until one day, you realized something unsettling. You couldn't remember the last time you felt fully present, not distracted, not performing, not pretending, just there, fully there. And that realization didn't come with panic. It came with something worse, acceptance. Because by then, this had become normal. You had learned to live at a distance from yourself. You had learned to override your instincts, to second-guess your feelings, to delay your needs, to suppress your reactions, not because you wanted to, but because it helped you remain acceptable. And acceptability became your survival strategy. You became someone others could rely on, someone stable, someone predictable, someone strong, and everyone respected you for it. They trusted you, they depended on you, they admired how composed you were, but they didn't see what it cost you. They didn't see the moments where you felt nothing, when you should have felt something. They didn't see the emptiness that followed your accomplishments. They didn't see the strange absence in moments that were supposed to matter. Because from the outside, you looked fine, and that's what made it invisible, not just to them, but to you. You told yourself this was maturity, growth, strength. You told yourself this was what it meant to be an adult, to be in control, to not be ruled by emotion. But control was never supposed to mean disappearance. Stability was never supposed to mean absence. Strength was never supposed to require you to leave yourself behind. And yet, somewhere along the way, that's exactly what happened. Not because you were weak, but because you were adaptive, because you learned, because you paid attention, because you did what you needed to do to survive environments, expectations, dynamics that slowly taught you being fully alive was not always safe. So you became less alive, not all at once, but enough. Enough to function, enough to continue, enough to exist, but not enough to feel like yourself. And if you're honest, there's a part of you that remembers, a part of you that knows this wasn't always who you were. There was a time when you reacted faster, laughed easier, felt deeper, cared without hesitation, before you learned to monitor yourself, before you learned to adjust, before you learned to disappear in small, socially acceptable ways. And that version of you didn't vanish randomly. That version of you was shaped, redirected, conditioned by forces you didn't fully see, for reasons you didn't fully understand. And the moment you realize that, everything begins to change. Because this was never about weakness. It was about adaptation. Adaptation sounds harmless, even intelligent. It sounds like something strong people do. And in many ways, it is. Your ability to adapt is the reason you survived environments that could have broken you. It's the reason you remained functional when things around you felt uncertain. It's the reason you learned how to stay in control when control was the only way to stay safe. But adaptation has a shadow. Because adaptation doesn't ask whether something is good for your aliveness. It only asks whether something improves your chances of survival. And those two things are not the same. Survival protects your existence. Aliveness protects your presence. And somewhere along the way, you were forced to choose. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through repetition, through subtle reinforcement, through invisible pressure. You learned which version of yourself made life easier and which version made life harder. You learned that being agreeable avoided conflict. You learned that being calm avoided attention. You learned that being useful, created value, and value created security. So you leaned into that version, the version of you that could be depended on, the version of you that didn't create problems, the version of you that didn't overwhelm others with too much truth. And slowly, that version became your identity, not because it was fully you, but because it was the safest you. And this is where the inner conflict began, because safety and truth rarely coexist perfectly. There were moments, small moments, where something inside you reacted honestly. A moment of anger, a moment of sadness, a moment of excitement, a moment of desire. And just as quickly, you felt the impulse to contain it, to soften it, to edit it, to make it more acceptable. You started managing yourself, observing yourself, correcting yourself, until your first instinct was no longer to feel, but to monitor. And that changes something fundamental inside a person. Because when you stop trusting your immediate experience, you start living one step removed from your own life. You don't fully enter moments anymore. You evaluate them. You don't fully express yourself. You calculate yourself. You don't fully feel emotions. You regulate them before they exist. And at first, this feels like maturity. It feels like emotional intelligence. It feels like control. But over time, control becomes distance. Distance becomes disconnection. And disconnection becomes identity. You become the person who is always okay. Even when you're not, you become the person who can handle everything. Even when it's costing you something invisible, you become the person others admire, but no longer recognize from the inside. And this creates a strange loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being unseen, even when you're surrounded by people, because they are interacting with the version of you that survived, not the version of you that once felt fully alive. And the more consistent you are in that role, the harder it becomes to remember what it felt like before, because your nervous system has learned a new baseline, a baseline of neutrality, of emotional efficiency, of controlled existence. And the longer you live there, the more unfamiliar aliveness begins to feel. Intensity starts to feel dangerous. Spontaneity starts to feel irresponsible. Honesty starts to feel risky. Not because they are, but because they are no longer familiar. And the human nervous system will always choose familiarity over freedom. Even when familiarity feels empty, because empty is predictable. Empty is manageable. Empty doesn't threaten stability. And stability became your highest priority. Not happiness, not fulfillment. Stability. You built a life that worked, a life that made sense, a life that others could understand. But somewhere inside that life, you stopped existing as a participant and started existing as a manager, managing your image, managing your reactions, managing your needs, managing your emotions, managing yourself. And management is not the same as living. Management is observation. Living is immersion. Management is control. Living is participation. Management keeps things stable. Living makes things real. And when you live too long in management, reality begins to feel distant. You watch yourself moving through your own life. You watch yourself saying the right things, doing the right things, being the right person, but you don't fully feel connected to the one doing it. And this is the inner conflict most people never put into words. Because from the outside, nothing appears wrong. You are responsible, reliable, stable, but internally, you are absent. Not completely gone, but not fully there. And the most confusing part is that this absence was created by your strength, not your weakness, by your intelligence, not your failure, by your ability to read environments, adapt to expectations, maintain stability, and survive. You became who you needed to be in order to exist, but existence was never supposed to cost you your aliveness. And yet, for many people, it does. Quietly, gradually, without announcement, until one day, they realize they have built a life that no longer contains them. Once you learn how to live this way, it becomes automatic. You don't wake up and decide to disconnect from yourself. Your system does it for you, quietly, efficiently, without asking, because your nervous system's primary job was never to make you feel alive. It was to make you safe. And safety is built through prediction, through pattern, through reducing uncertainty. So your system started identifying which parts of you created risk. Not physical risk, but emotional risk, the risk of rejection, the risk of embarrassment, the risk of being misunderstood, the risk of being too much or not enough. And once it identified those risks, it began minimizing them. Not by changing the world, but by changing you. It taught you to hesitate, to pause before expressing something real, to question your natural reactions, to delay your honesty, and eventually, to stop accessing parts of yourself altogether. Not because those parts disappeared, but because access to them was restricted. And restricted access feels like absence. But it isn't absence, it's protection. Protection built on past evidence. Evidence your nervous system collected over years. Moments where openness was not met with safety. Moments where vulnerability created distance. Moments where authenticity created instability. So, your system adapted? It created a version of you that could exist without triggering those outcomes. A version that could function smoothly, predictably, reliably, and that version became your default. Not because it was complete, but because it was efficient. And efficiency became more important than aliveness. Because aliveness is unpredictable. Aliveness feels deeply. Aliveness reacts honestly. Aliveness risks disruption. And disruption is something your system learned to avoid. So instead, you became consistent, controlled, contained, and containment feels like stability. But containment also limits expansion. You cannot feel deep joy without also risking deep sadness. You cannot feel fully present without also risking uncertainty. You cannot feel alive without also risking change. So your system chose neutrality because neutrality protects continuity. Neutrality protects structure. Neutrality protects survival. But neutrality does not protect your sense of being alive. It protects your ability to continue even when continuing feels empty. And this is why so many people arrive at a point in their life where nothing is technically wrong, but nothing feels fully real. They built a self designed to survive, not a self designed to live. And survival is a powerful skill, but it was never meant to be your permanent identity. Because survival mode is supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to help you pass through something, not become the place where you stay. But if no one ever shows you the difference, you start believing this is just who you are. Someone calm, someone stable, someone unaffected, someone who doesn't need much, someone who doesn't feel much. And over time, you stop remembering that this was something you learned, not something you were born as. And this is the moment where something begins to change. Not outside you, but inside your understanding. Because the moment you see this clearly, you can no longer fully believe the story you were told about yourself. The story that said you became this way because something was wrong with you. Because weakness doesn't create this level of adaptation. Awareness does. Intelligence does. Sensitivity does. Your nervous system didn't fail you. It protected you. It studied your environment. It recognized patterns. And it made adjustments. Not to erase you, but to help you continue existing inside conditions that required you to be smaller, quieter, more controlled. And when you realize that, something shifts, because this was never random. It was systematic. It was gradual. It was learned, which means it is not your identity. It is your conditioning. And conditioning feels permanent. Because you've lived inside it for so long, it feels natural, automatic, normal. But something being familiar does not mean it is original to you. It only means it was repeated enough times to feel like home, even when it never truly was. And this realization can be unsettling because it forces you to confront something most people avoid. The person you became was shaped by what you needed to survive, not by what you needed to feel alive. You learned to maintain stability. You learned to avoid risk. You learned to control yourself. And control gave you predictability. Predictability gave you safety. But safety came at a cost, because every time you chose safety over truth, you moved one step further away from yourself. Not in a dramatic way, but in subtle negotiations. Moments where you traded authenticity for acceptance. Moments where you traded honesty for belonging. Moments where you traded aliveness for stability. And those trades felt reasonable at the time. They made sense. They helped you function. They helped you remain connected to the world around you. But over time, those small trades accumulated until the distance between who you are and who you present became significant. And distance creates disconnection, not because you disappeared, but because you became divided. There is the version of you that exists externally, and the version of you that still exists internally, watching, waiting, not gone, just inaccessible. And the strangest part is, you may have spent years believing that internal version no longer exists because you stopped feeling it. You stopped hearing it. You stopped trusting it. But absence of access is not the same as absence of existence. It simply means the pathway became quiet, not destroyed, just unused. And pathways that go unused feel invisible, until something draws your attention back to them, until something interrupts the automatic nature of your conditioning, until something makes you realize this was something you learned, which means it was never the core of who you are. And that realization alone begins to loosen the certainty you had about yourself. It creates a small space between you and the version of you that survival built, a space where observation becomes possible, a space where awareness begins. And awareness is the first moment where automatic patterns lose their total control, not because they disappear immediately, but because you are no longer completely inside them. You are now able to see them. And the moment you see something clearly, you are no longer entirely defined by it. You are in relationship with it, not trapped inside it. And that changes something fundamental, because if this was learned, then it was never your fault. It was your system responding, adjusting, protecting, doing exactly what it believed was necessary to help you remain here, even if remaining here meant losing access to parts of yourself along the way. And this realization carries a quiet implication, one most people don't recognize immediately: the implication that what was learned was never meant to be permanent. Part 7. Ending Bridge. Approximately 600 words. U.S. English with pauses, emotional closure, without full resolution. Powerful bridge to video 3. Release. Self-blame. And if it was never meant to be permanent, then something inside you was never meant to stay hidden forever. Because adaptation can protect you, but it cannot erase you. It can bury signals, but it cannot destroy their source. It can create distance, but distance is not disappearance. And this is where most people misunderstand their own story. They believe the numbness means something inside them died, that they crossed a line they can never return from, that this is simply who they are now. But numbness is not proof of death. It is proof of suppression, proof that something was contained, not eliminated. Because if it had truly disappeared, you wouldn't feel the absence. You wouldn't notice something missing. You wouldn't be here listening to this. There would be no tension, no question, no quiet sense that something isn't right. Absence does not ache. Suppression does. And that ache, that subtle awareness, that quiet discomfort you carry, is not a flaw. It's a signal that something inside you is still there, still present, still waiting, not demanding, not forcing, just waiting. Waiting for the moment when you finally understand that what happened to you was never a personal failure. It was a response to environments, to expectations, to experiences that required you to become someone else in order to remain safe. And when you see that clearly, something unexpected begins to happen. The shame you carried starts to loosen, because shame depends on the belief that you caused your own disappearance. But what if you didn't? What if the version of you that faded didn't fade because it was weak, but because it was protecting you? What if your numbness was never betrayal, but loyalty to your survival, loyalty to your continuation, loyalty to keeping you here, even if it meant becoming someone you no longer recognized? And if that's true, then the story you've been telling yourself, the story that something is wrong with you, may not be true at all. It may simply be incomplete. Because the moment you realize you were protecting yourself is the moment a new question appears. Not, what's wrong with me? But, what did I survive? And that question changes everything, because you cannot blame yourself and understand yourself at the same time. One of those stories has to break, and most people never question the one they were given. They carry the quiet assumption that something inside them failed, that they became weaker, colder, less alive. And over time, they stop asking why. They only accept who they've become. But there is something far more unsettling, something most people never consider. What if you didn't disappear? What if you adapted, not because you were broken, but because something inside you was trying to protect you? And if that's true, then the numbness you feel may not be evidence of your failure. It may be evidence of your survival. And when you truly see that, something begins to loosen, not forcefully, but quietly. The years of blaming yourself, the years of believing something was wrong with you. I explored that in the next part, because understanding why you were never the problem can change the way you see yourself forever. You'll find it waiting for you in the description when you're ready to stop carrying what was never yours.